We are honored to have Craig Formby here as the guest of honor at our 25th International Conference on Tinnitus and Hyperacusis. I can say that it's obvious for many years that Craig is a very bright person and very hardworking. In addition to that, however, he's very insightful and takes things very seriously and has very comprehensive studies that he's done and is working on. And he cares, and he involves and has included for many, many years a team that knows what they're doing and are doing that in a very systematic and thorough fashion. And because of all those characteristics, we are very fortunate to have Craig caring about tinnitus and hyperacusis. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Craig Formby as our guest of honor.
This is a real pleasure. I have been to, I think this is my fourth tinnitus conference here at Iowa, and this is one of my favorite conferences. I've traveled a lot with the clinical trial that Bobby described on yesterday for the past 6 to 8 years to get the clinical trial going. So I try not to travel very much. My home's actually in Baltimore, but I work at University of Alabama, so I try not to travel much. So when I come to these conferences, I really want to be here. So thank you very much. Let me give you a little background. For the last almost 20 years, I've conducted two parallel lines of research. One along the line of hyperacusis, which I'll talk about today, and then the clinical trial that Bobby described yesterday. I don't know how clear it was, or if you know any of the history of the trial we did, or Bobby reported on yesterday, the TRT trial, but that trial, we started preparing for it in 1999. I was at University of Maryland at the time, and I'd come over from Johns Hopkins in 1994 and really had no involvement with the tinnitus program until Pavel Jastrzebow left in 1999 to go to Emory. So I sort of inherited running of the tinnitus center at the University of Maryland, which meant I oversaw Susan Gold. So she was really the tinnitus center at the University of Maryland. I didn't know whether TRT worked or not. The Hopkins folks had not been very enthusiastic about TRT, and it was such a revolutionary protocol that I'd heard a presentation by one of the junior faculty members at Maryland in the early 90s, and they were, let's say, underwhelmed by TRT at that point. So when I came over to Maryland, I sort of sat it out for about 5 years, and once Powell left, since I was now charged with running the Tinnitus and Hyperacusis Center at the University of Maryland, I was very curious whether it worked or not, and we really needed to conduct a clinical trial. And so Bobby and I set out to develop a clinical trial, which only took us 10 years to get funded. So we went through a planning grant and three rounds of formal reviews at NINDCD, National Heart, Blood, Lung Institute, NIN, National Institute of Neurological Disease and Stroke. So I think everybody got a shot at us in terms of reviewing our applications. So eventually we got funded in 2009, and then Bobby presented yesterday the results, which were another 8 years in coming. So that was over half my career has been spent trying to either get that study funded or actually conduct the study. Then when I came over in 1994 from Hopkins, I didn't know very much about hyperacusis, and in fact, I knew virtually nothing about hyperacusis. And so Susan Gold, who I've already mentioned and you saw yesterday, came and shared a set of audiograms with me showing loudness discomfort level changes. And that was when I got very interested in this. So you'll see as I go through this, I'll go through this sort of historically and give you some idea of why we did what we did and what we learned along the way. So let me introduce people. I always usually have this slide at the end, and people don't get acknowledged for what they've done. So Susan was the person that developed the counseling that we've been using and sort of shepherded us through the TRT issues that we dealt with. Monica Hawley sort of dropped in from heaven somewhere around. I guess when did you show up at?
2000.
In 2000. So Monica's husband was a resident at Johns Hopkins, and so Monica came across over to us and worked with us on most of the time on the hyperacusis stuff. Gwen Sherlock, who I trained at Hopkins, was CFY with me at Hopkins. We brought over to Maryland, and Gwen will become the chair of the ATA board as of 2 weeks. Is it? Okay, so she's now at Walter Reed. So we're all asunder. We're all at different places than where we were. Mike Kieser was a student statistician for us and was terrific. Ellen Frederick was an audiologist in the Tinnitus and Hyperacusis Center and was involved early on in some of the analysis that you'll see. Peg Korzak's professor at Towson University. She's been involved with us in conducting electrophysiological measures of pre-treatment and post-treatment on our hyperacusis patients. Jason Parton's a statistician at the University of Alabama. The four students at the top, Allison, Christine, Justine, and Kimberly, were College Park students that were involved in the clinical trial I described. Rebecca Brooks and Joanne Payne also were involved in that, and General Hearing Instruments has developed all the treatment devices that you'll see for our trial. So they've been a really great industry partner for us. So I've got a lot to cover. I'll go fast. I've designated Monica as my clarifier, so if I don't make a point clear, she's to interrupt and clarify for me. So I don't know how much you know about hyperacusis and epidemiology. It'd be good for me to know who I'm talking to first. So how many are students in the Iowa program, or students anywhere that are attending? Okay, good. And how many are audiologists here? So the majority are audiologists. Patients? Okay. Who am I missing? Professors? Physicians? Yeah. Other? Okay. So the majority are audiologists. So I'm going to make some assumptions so I can go fairly fast. So a large majority of hyperacusis patients have tinnitus, and about half of tinnitus patients have hyperacusis. So it's a problem, and for a lot of folks, estimates of the prevalence of hyperacusis in the general population vary between about 0.6% and 15%. Somebody said 6% yesterday, so I'm not sure what study that was, but you can pick a study that'll put you in the range of that. If you don't see your favorite disorder up here, you should petition your congressman and find out why it's not up here. But virtually every one of these diseases, disorders has been associated with, in some way, with hyperacusis. I think part of the problem is the definition for hyperacusis, which is let's say there's no consensus on what hyperacusis really is, and there are various forms of it. These are the types of hyperacusis that Rich has described in his review paper that Brian Pollard funded. And so loudness hyperacusis, those are the LDL drops or collapse of the LDLs, and I'll show you that in just a second. Annoyance hyperacusis, also misophonia, which you've heard about, fear hyperacusis or phonophobia, and then pain hyperacusis, which Brian Pollard is very interested in. Now, this slide is here to show you the difference in an individual with loudness recruitment from a person with traditional hyperacusis. So let's see, I'm sitting in the audience. So the right side here, so the hyperacusis is shown by the collapse of the loudness discomfort levels onto the audiogram. So it's a very narrow dynamic range because the loudness discomfort levels have fallen toward the audiogram. The middle panel with the recruitment shows the dynamic range is decreased because of the drop in the hearing thresholds, but the loudness discomfort levels are the same as normal. So the normal audiogram is shown over on the far side. So you've seen this from Rich yesterday. So the normal loudness growth function in black, the red symbols are the hyperacusis loudness growth, and the recruiting ear is shown by the blue symbols. So you can see the hyperacusis individual has a very narrow dynamic range as indicated by the red arrows at the top relative to the recruiting listener. Goldstein and Schulman in about, I think, 1996 added an additional version of hyperacusis based on something in the literature about sound sensitivity and hyperacusis where the dynamic range is less than 60 dB. And that came from, originally, I think, from Jastreboff and Hazel. And what they came up with was a classification for hyperacusis, which we've contrasted here between the what they call dynamic range hyperacusis. So if you have a dynamic range less than 60 dB, then you would have various versions of, or classes of mild, moderate, and severe hyperacusis, depending on how narrow the dynamic range is. So they also came up with a classification for loudness hyperacusis, or the loudness discomfort level, based on loudness discomfort levels, where if you have 95 dB or greater LDLs across frequency, then you would be considered to have normal sound tolerance, and mild, severe, and moderate sound tolerance based on the ranges I'm showing here. So I'm not going through all of those. But it's an interesting idea, and it's never, as far as I know, it's never really caught on. Now, if you look at your program, you'll see two titles for my talk. One on the cover and another listed by where I'm designated at a certain time. So I was not sure whether I should be talking about effectiveness of treatments or studies in hyperacusis. So I will throw this in as my effectiveness of treatment slide with one that'll follow. There really is very little evidence of effectiveness of treatments other than for maybe counseling and for the sound therapies. Surgically, there's no note up here on surgery, but spear canal dehiscence, and if that's the issue, then they may have ability to plug the spear canal, spear canal wall. But Rich can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is from one of the studies that reviews he and others did. So it's a 2014 AJA presentation, so he can correct me at the end if I'm wrong. Now this comes from, I think, Brian's group. They're pretty critical. They try to take apart treatments and look at treatments to see what's effective and what's not, and so they're a hard group. So these were the ones that the sound therapy and counseling evidence that they thought was relevant at points in the past. I'll be talking about, in this presentation, I'll be talking about the Formby Studies here, the Hazel study. Juris is a CBT, so a primarily counseling study. I think they use some sound in some of their activities, but I'm not very familiar with it. Neuromonics should be moved over from sound only to sound plus counseling, so you can see the loudness discomfort level changes associated with their study. Norena's study is very interesting. It was a sound only study. I think Brian's group called that a hopping sound study. So it's dynamic stimulus, composite stimulus. It includes I think pure tones or some narrow frequency over some narrow frequency range confined to the hearing loss area. The study was done in tinnitus patients with hyperacusis or reduced sound tolerance. They had no counseling. They presented their stimuli under phones for I think an hour or two a day over a period of, I think they had showed different periods of time over which they followed the patients. It was pretty brief, 2 weeks to a month, and they got fairly sizable treatment effects. No one's ever replicated the study as far as I know. So it's interesting because no counseling was involved. And I don't know how well the treatment effects hold up, but someone should follow up on their study. So this is primary evidence for effectiveness of sound therapy and counseling at the point whenever they did this analysis. I think it might have been in 2015 or so. And for the most part, that's still the same results you'd see today. Now, the history of sound tolerance training and dynamic range expansion goes back to the Harvard Hearing Aid Report, which Hallowell Davis was interested in improving fitting of hearing aids before there was compression processing for hearing aids. So at that point, they would have virtually no good electronics other than peak clipping for hearing aids. So his idea was, and I'll get to it here in just a second, his idea was you wanted to expand the dynamic range as much as possible. If you could get it up to 60 dB for a dynamic range for a hearing aid user, then one size would fit all for a hearing aid. Well, that was a lofty goal, so he comes along and he commissions Dick Silverman at Central Institute for the Deaf to conduct some sound tolerance training studies, which used speech stimuli and pure tone stimuli presented at high levels. So they were presented just below the loudness discomfort level for the individual listener. So they did the studies both in hearing impaired patients and in normal hearing patients. And I'll show you the results here in just a second. So they would present these high-level stimuli for a few minutes weekly over a 6-week period. And then Schmidts will come along after 20 years or more, and will refute sound tolerance training, which really never caught on because I doubt any IRBs or clinical programs would allow you to do it these days. And then I'll jump 25 years or so, or 20 years after Schmidt's, and we'll get into modern use of sound therapy for tolerance training and adjustment. So I mentioned the Harvard Hearing Aid Report. Davis described it as an acoustic massage, so you present levels 80, 90 dB or so just below hearing thresholds, either speech or pure tones, and again, his goal was to improve hearing aid fitting. So here are Silverman's results. And so I'm pretty confident you couldn't do this study today. They had normal hearing again, and they had defective hearing. So they had a mix of conductive and sensorineural and so forth. So what I'm showing here are under thresholds of discomfort, tickle, and pain are the initial presentation levels they presented under each condition and the final presentation levels they presented. So these are in SPL, so these aren't in DBHL. So they're a little bit lower than what you would think of right off the bat. But the interesting thing was the discomfort for the final discomfort for levels for the normal hearing and the hearing impaired both shifted by about 10 dB after the training. And most of the training effect occurred between the second and third week, so you didn't need to go out to 6 weeks to get whatever the training effect was. Tickle showed similar effects to discomfort in terms of shift from initial to final. And then the pain, not too unexpected, the pain didn't change very much. So they're up in the 140 range on the 140 dB or so. So they were pretty enthusiastic about this, but I don't think it ever really caught on. And you could think at CID it's sensible at CID they'd be interested in this because at that point they had a lot of severely and profoundly hearing impaired children, so they want to give those kids as much dynamic range as they could. So So actually the CID folks would have been a little bit interested in the problem differently from maybe from Hallowell Davis and the Harvard Hearing Aid Report. So Schmidt tries to replicate Silverman's work. I think he does some of the shifts in loudness discomfort level, but then he can't show that they're functionally meaningful improvements. That is to say, they can shift the loudness discomfort levels, but speech discrimination is not improved, so they're not functional improvements going along with the changes in the loudness discomfort level. So basically, Schmidt kills sound tolerance training, which really hadn't taken off anyhow. So jumping forward now 20 years or so to obscure tinnitus proceedings report at one of the early conferences. I don't know which of the conferences it was, but Jonathan Hazel and Jackie Sheldrake would present and show this set of their original data. So these values here are initial LDL values for a group of tinnitus patients who had hyperacusis. And these are their treatment results at the end of their treatments. And so what they showed was that about half the subjects were improved by 8 to 10 dB after 2 months in terms of shifts in their loudness discomfort levels, and then about 3/4 were improved after about 6 months in terms of their loudness discomfort levels. And so they were using basically noise maskers or noise generators that they had a desensitization type protocol. So they would turn these noise generators on at a very low level for these individuals, and they would gradually increase the level of the noise generators over time. And so this was a very soft, in contrast to Silverman and Davis's approach. This is the first application of low-level sound therapy for expanding the dynamic range in treating hyperacusis. So this sound therapy protocol they came up with, and they did have a counseling component to it. So I asked Jackie about it, and it was offered in 3 counseling sessions. It's not clear to me what the counseling was exactly, but there was some counseling associated with this. It would become, the sound therapy protocol would become the basis of the sound therapy protocol used in TRT. So I've told you that Susan Gold would share with me, come in on occasion and share with me some audiometric results for some of the patients. And one of the first that I can remember seeing was this particular patient. And what is shown here are the audiometric thresholds and squares at the top. And then 4 sets of loudness discomfort levels over the course of tinnitus retraining therapy. So this patient was being seen for tinnitus and for the hyperacusis problem. So again, Susan would say, well, we're going to treat the hyperacusis first, and then along the way we'll treat the tinnitus. So you're seeing 4 sets of results, beginning with the circles at the top in February of 2096, going a year and a half later roughly to May of 98. So that's roughly an 18-month period, and you're seeing shifts in their loudness discomfort levels over, 40 dB range in some cases. It's the biggest treatment effect I'd ever seen in audiology. So keep in mind, I'm thinking, well, you've got Davis and Silverman are trying to change loudness discomfort levels by presenting high-level stimuli, and here you get these massive effects with some low-level noise background, which I thought was just amazing. And so at this point, we start data mining, because the Tinnitus and Hyperacusis Center had hundreds of patients that really we'd never gone through and tried to do any systematic analysis on their findings, particularly with respect to loudness discomfort levels. So we did a summary of the findings for individuals who had received TRT. They received noise generators and some had received hearing aids. And we were looking at tinnitus patients who had hyperacusis or tinnitus patients who didn't have hyperacusis. So we did a lot of different types of analyses on these data. The requirement for the individuals, I think in noise generators were they had to have follow-up treatment or follow-up results, at least one set of follow-up results. So some had multiple sets of follow-up results, but they had to have at least one. And I think the average follow-up that we were looking at was about 9 months. So almost across the board, they were getting big treatment effects on the order of 10 dB or so. There were also subjective improvements in sound tolerance. In some cases were functional, and we could measure the functional improvements. So we had functional reports in our data records. Positive treatment effects, regardless of presence or absence of hearing loss, tinnitus, or hyperacusis. Although I would say that the tinnitus alone patients tended to have be less effectively treated than the hyperacusis patients. The hyperacusis patients were shifting by on average, about 17 dB, and tinnitus patients by about 12 dB. So, and that may be understandable because the hyperacusis patients have more room to shift than the tinnitus patients do. But just universally, we were getting big treatment effects in our patients. So going back to Davis and wanting to improve fitting of hearing aids, this seemed like the logical way to approach expanding the dynamic range for individuals who were difficult to fit hearing impaired patients because they had reduced dynamic ranges. So this leads into our first clinical trial. Well, I mentioned that this came out of our set of analyses. The individuals that were using hearing aids were not seeing the same shift in their discomfort levels and dynamic range as were the patients being treated with noise generators. So effectively, the hearing aids were acting in a somewhat transparent way, so they were not improving the dynamic ranges in the way that the noise generators were. And this I think, will ultimately turn out to be very important for some future research we want to do. This turned out to be an interesting study too. Before I get to the clinical trial, let me describe this because it will be helpful, I think, for understanding the clinical trial. In the early 90s, maybe the late 80s, since there were no good treatments for tinnitus, we'd see a lot of people in earplugs, and that was sort of the management for the tinnitus patients. So you have people wearing earplugs, and then the noise generators came along, and so there was not very good evidence one way or the other to say, well, would you be better off wearing earplugs or being in noise generators? I think Ross Coles possibly was first to suggest that wearing earplugs was detrimental. If it was not him, then it would have been Jack Vernon or possibly Jonathan Hazel. So somewhere in the 80s, they were beginning to question whether you should wear earplugs or not if you were trying to manage a hyperacusis patient. So we set out to basically test the idea that earplugs were bad for a hyperacusis patient and that noise generators were good for hyperacusis patients. The idea being that if you wear earplugs over a prolonged period of time, you deprive the auditory system of sound. And so through some mechanism that we don't understand, the auditory systems will turn up the gain of the system at some presumably higher level of the auditory pathways. So if they turn up the gain of the auditory system, that means you don't need sound to be turned up as loud in order to perceive the loudness of the sound as you would before you were treated with earplugs. And the noise generators were just the reverse. The idea was that the noise generators would somehow rescale or recalibrate the auditory system by turning the gain of the system down so you could listen at higher levels, so your sound tolerance improved. And that's exactly what we saw. So these are the noise generator results, baseline, and then the results for the earplugs. So you became more sensitive after wearing earplugs for 2 weeks constantly, and less sensitive after wearing noise generators for that constantly for roughly 24 hours a day. The really surprising thing was that we'd matched the earplugs and the noise generators in terms of threshold shift, so there was no good way to match them otherwise. So you wanted to produce with the earplugs and the ear moles the same threshold shift in the auditory system so that you'd have equivalent strength of the treatments. Most of the treatment effects, when you matched them up that way, it gave a high frequency emphasis to the treatment. And so one of the surprising things we found is you got the same effect at 500 hertz as you did at 2,000 hertz, which suggested strongly it's a central phenomenon. So, and other folks have found the same thing. So Norina, in his study where they restricted the sound treatment to the higher frequencies associated with hearing loss, found exactly the same thing. So this is, I don't think anybody debates this information at this point. So here, finally get around to the clinical trial that we were really interested in. And so it gets published in Seminars in Hearing in 2015. It starts in, I think we started in 2002. We had some problems. Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005 when we were just getting really going on the study. It knocked general hearing instruments out for a year. So they couldn't provide any treatments for us for over a year. So we had patients who were scheduled to get treatments that never got them and dropped out. So we lost a good many subjects out of the study who never even got started in the study, but for whom we'd arranged to get the treatments for them. So NIH sponsors this trial. They sponsored the little ear plugging and noise generator study too. So this is the second NIH-sponsored study then that is related to sound tolerance and sound therapy. So the goals of the trial were first to try and replicate the findings of Hazel and Sheldrick, and then to extend the treatment to problematic hearing aid users who had reduced LDLs and elevated hearing thresholds, which gave rise to their diminished dynamic ranges. So what we were after were basically the garden variety sensorineural hearing impaired listener who was a difficult to fit patient that you'd see in a traditional audiometric clinic. So we weren't after necessarily the more traditional hyperacusis patient with drops in their LDLs to really low levels. So we wanted to make this more a general effect treatment. So we were asking the question, would the intervention expand the dynamic ranges for individuals pre and post in terms of loudness growth functions for hyperacusis as well as for people having more traditional sensorineural hearing loss and loudness recruitment. So the first one's shown here. This is what we were after. Mm-hmm.
Can you point out that they could have tinnitus, they didn't have to, but it was not problematic?
Right. So if they had tinnitus, it was a secondary problem for them.
And that wasn't screening criteria?
Right. Right. So again, you've seen the loudness growth functions for the individual with hyperacusis, which would be reflected by the, I don't know what shade is appearing there, but the aqua or the light blue color, loudness growth function. And then what we were hoping to do is to shift them over so that we shifted them at least to the normal limits and then past the normal limits if we could. So we wanted to give them as big a dynamic range as we possibly could by using a sound therapy protocol and together with counseling. And then the recruiting listener, we thought we probably could be able to shift them too, or at least we hope we could. which would be the first treatment I know of for sensorineural hearing loss. So this would sort of be icing on the cake if we could do this. So our study was designed as a randomized placebo-controlled, placebo on the sound therapy clinical trial. Our investigators were blinded as to the noise generator group assignment, but not to the counseling assignment. So what we had were 4 groups. The ambitious original plan for this study was we would have 20 subjects in each group. Well, you can see we didn't get 20 subjects in each group, but we were lucky, I guess, in the end to get this many subjects given the Katrina issues we faced. So if you look at the first block, which was group 1, so they're getting the full treatment. They're getting the noise generators and the counseling. Second group is getting counseling and placebo noise generators. Now, the placebo noise generators are what Bobby described yesterday, and I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. So there was short-acting noise. The noise decays after about 30 minutes, and by 70 minutes, it's gone totally silent. If the individual wants to test to see if they can still hear the noise, they remove the device from the ear. The device resets to the original noise setting. So if a clinician wants to check it or the patient wants to check it, it'll sound the way it should sound when we started out. So it's a really nice little trick we used. And the reason we could do this is because if you listen to these little low-level noise generators at the level we're presenting the noise will just adapt or be perceived to adapt over a short period of time. So both those receive in the conventional sound generators and in the placebo sound generators over time, unless you really draw attention to it, the sound will appear to adapt totally out. It's not in the case of the conventional sound generators, but it does in the case of the placebo, and it's not adapting, it's actually turning off. So the third group gets counseling, or no counseling in the sound generators, so they're getting sound therapy, but they're not getting any counseling. And then the fourth group gets placebo sound generators and no counseling. They effectively get nothing. So the treatment components, again, are counseling, one single counseling session by Susan Gold for about an hour. So she focuses on the hearing loss, the sound tolerance, she gets some auditory gain issues, and the important enriched sound in the environment. The sound therapy is what I have just described to you, and the real ear measured response looks like this. It's broadband, it's a low-level broadband sound, but ear canal resonance will emphasize the higher frequencies. So open fit custom ITE shells sounds like a soft seashell if you listen to it. Noise is rated as soft or comfortable but soft, I think. So it doesn't interfere with communication. It produces threshold shift in the primary frequency range of effect of about 5 to 10 dB for most of the patients we had. Noise generators, we ask the patients to wear them at least 8 hours a day bilaterally, and I've described the placebo for you already. So our subject inclusion criteria, again, were difficult to fit hearing aid candidates or unsuccessful hearing aid users because of their limited dynamic ranges, complaints of sound intolerance for aided or unaided listening, LDLs less than or equal to 90 dB or dynamic range less than or equal to 60 dB, and for at least one or more audiometric frequency on the LDLs, and I think on the dynamic range it was, one or more on the dynamic range and 2 or more, I think, on the LDLs in terms of number of frequencies affected. Mild to moderate sensorineural hearing loss, and they're shown here. Here's our groups are. So the audiograms are top, the loudness discomfort levels are shown at the bottom, so we matched up pretty well. Primary outcome measures in terms of what we were looking for graduation were to measure loudness discomfort level judgments and categorical loudness judgments, so the contour test, Ryman-Cox's contour test, which you start at low levels, go up, I think, in 5 dB increments. You give a sheet of paper that has the categories on the sheet of paper, so very soft, soft, comfortable but soft, comfortable, loud but comfortable, loud, and uncomfortably loud. So those would be the 7 categories that they would be reporting as the sound levels went up at a given frequency. So we measured the LDLs at 1,000 and 8,000. We also measured white noise LDLs. And then we measured categorical judgments at 500, 2, and 4, I think. 500, 2,000, 4,000 hertz. So we made our measurements at baseline and then monthly over a treatment period of 5 to 12 months. We didn't know how long we needed to measure initially in terms of how long the treatment needed to go on before we would start seeing effects. We went out to almost a year on some of our early folks, and then it was clear that we didn't need to be going out that long and that we would see sizable treatment effects for some individuals much sooner. So we made the decision that if they exceeded 10 dB or more in terms of change in the LDL or the uncomfortably loud judgments, 2 consecutive months, we'd graduate them out. So the goal was to get these folks into hearing aids. So here the results are. So the contour 7 is uncomfortably loud judgment, LDL. You know what the LDL is. The LDLs are shown in red in terms of the change from our baseline measures. The blue shows the contour change for the level 7 of the uncomfortably loud judgment. So the group that got the big effects were the people getting full treatment, counseling plus noise generators. The individuals in group 2 were basically getting counseling alone. The individuals in group 3 were basically getting sound therapy alone, and the individuals in group 4 got effectively nothing. So the efficacy, if we look at by group, 80% of the folks in group 1 got a positive treatment effect, as indicated by their graduation effects of 10 dB or more for LDLs or for the UCL categorical judgments. And all the other groups got less than 50% in terms of the individuals in the group. Now here are the contour results for 500 hertz. I can show you 2,000 or 4,000 and they all look the same. So you see the shift indicated by the black symbols in the categorical loudness judgments going to the right or to higher sound levels relative to their baseline treatment results, which are the open symbols. And so you see the group 1's getting large effects, particularly at the higher levels. Noise generators along the group 3 group got a little bit of an effect. The other 2 groups got virtually nothing. So here, if we go back, so look at the uncomfortably loud judgments for group 1. So you can see the biggest separation between baseline and the treatment results for group 1 in the right or the top panel there on your left. So look at it, and you can see the size of the treatment effect over time. So it's on the order of in excess of, I guess, 12 dB or so. It didn't matter what frequency it was, you get the same result across frequency. And so here the results over time are for the others. So it's clear that the group 1 folks were the privileged ones and the others were not so privileged in terms of the treatment effects. Now I mentioned that we got bigger effects for the higher level sounds, for the uncomfortably loud judgments and loud judgments. Got relatively little effect for the very soft sounds, soft and comfortable, but soft. Comfortable falls sort of midway between the loud and the soft sounds in terms of the treatment effect. So again, we wanted to come up with the results showing that for a hyperacusis patient, we could shift them out in terms of the loudness growth to at least normal. And in this case, this particular patient, we could shift them out on the order of, I don't know how big it is, at high levels, 30, 40 dB maybe. And for the recruiting year, Baseline, again, the unfilled triangles are shown in the bottom panel. We shifted them up too. So we were, the take-home message is that this treatment was working for hyperacusis patients and for more traditional sensorineural hearing loss patients, which is pretty exciting. We need more data and more patients, but at least some of the folks are getting these treatment effects we were hoping to see.
So, can you add that we cut them off, and so we only saw these very large treatments in the early groups that we kept them out of hearing aids for a long time?
Right. So some of these folks, we took them out to up to a year. And so we might have seen these effects, big effects in other individuals had we tested long enough, but we made a decision we were trying to get them into hearing aids, so we didn't, once they met our graduation criteria, we stopped. So remember I told you that Schmidt's basically killed sound tolerance training because he couldn't show functional benefits from the dynamic range expansion or shift in loudness discomfort levels. Well, we were very interested in this little problem, and so these results are for 5T, they're shown here at the top. So she's getting big treatment effects. So what this figure shows are the line here, the continuous line here, are predictions from the Jerry Studebaker's STEPS program, which basically is an AI prediction for a group of hearing impaired listeners with comparable hearing loss to our particular patient here. And the RAL scores basically are think of it in terms of correct NU6 word scores. So that you see that if we present initially at baseline for comfortable sound levels and score the NU6 scores, they're coming in just a little over 40% for both ears. So these are NU6. They're coming in where you would expect to see on the function if the audibility of the speech energy were what it was at what levels at about 50 dB. And so for a 50 dB signal, which is her comfortable level, she's coming in with her speech scores around 40%. After treatment, she was able to go up 12 dB or so to attain comfortable sound levels for her presentation, and she's scoring about 80% in both ears. So that's what we'd hope to be able to see. So here the results are for improvement in word scores at both comfortable and loud but okay levels. So the symbols, the filled symbols are her post-treatment results, and the unfilled symbols are her pre-treatment results. The exciting part of this is her post-treatment comfortable levels and comfortable performance scores are better than her pre-treatment scores were at baseline. You will say anything more, Monica? No? So this is a big deal for us. So we're actually seeing not only does the dynamic range expand, but also the functionally it's important in improving speech discrimination or word recognition. So our results are consistent with treatment effects reported by Hazel and Sheldrick. 80% of the subjects with reduced dynamic ranges who benefited from the full intervention implemented with the noise generators in counseling. Some patients improved with partial treatment, but less than 45% or so of the patients in the alternative intervention groups received a benefit that would be consistent with our graduation criteria. Full intervention benefit usually occurred within 2 to 4 months of treatment onset with full stable effects by 6 months. Our protocol appears to offer a clinically practical alternative to high-level sound tolerance training to expand the dynamic range. Word recognition scores were shown to improve with treatment in subjects who had reduced sound tolerance and reduced dynamic ranges, which we were able to expand. providing clinical evidence of a real functional benefit, and again, in contrast to sound tolerance training. The people that completed the full treatment and graduated often moved into hearing aids, and we could show after treatment they often received functional improvements and were able then to wear the hearing aids that they were not able to wear before at reasonable levels. And the treatment benefit, I haven't shown, but the treatment benefit may be partially or fully sustained after we put them in amplification. So the treatment effect doesn't just go away once we cease the use of the noise generator. So at the end of the treatment, they could continue to wear the noise generators or not, and if they received a treatment benefit, then we were able to put them in hearing aids. And once we did, we followed them, and we were able to follow a few to be able to see that their treatment effects continued. So this was an important study for us in terms of being able to show that this sound tolerance protocol could actually benefit hearing aid users or difficult to fit hearing aid users. So let's go back to RR again. So I want you to focus on the left ear here at 4,000 hertz. So you can see what the threshold is in the squares. You can see that the black circle here at the top, that's the first loudness discomfort level measure that we had for them. So I think of that as a baseline measure. So what you're going to see is that the loudness discomfort level at 4,000 hertz is going to shift by about 25 dB over the course of treatment. Now this is RR again. So I'm showing the baseline or audiogram, which the audiogram was not going to change. And that first treatment loudness discomfort levels are cross frequency. So again, focus on the one that's at 4,000 hertz. What you're seeing here is if you take that individual and you plug in these data into the DSL fitting routine and prescriptive fitting routine that takes into account the hearing threshold of the individual, in this case at 4,000 hertz, and the loudness discomfort level that I'm showing here at 4,000 hertz at pre-treatment, then this is what DSL will spit out in terms of the output and input response from the hearing aid. So that's what DSL wants to fit that individual with at 4,000 hertz. And if you look down, the difference between the input and output levels gives you the gain across level. So it's about the difference between the input of 50 dB and I can't really see well here, 50 dB or so, and the output's around 60, a little over 60 dB or so. So the difference would be about 12 dB in terms of the corresponding level down the bottom panel listed as gain, okay? So if you go across, you'll see the gain response that's being prescribed for that individual. It's characteristic of wide dynamic range compression hearing aids or nonlinear hearing aids. They're going to prescribe more gain for soft sounds than they do for comfortable or louder sounds. So they prescribe systematically less gain for the louder sounds. So you look across, you see that baseline result from the left panel represented again over in this other panel. And now we're going to go through and we're going through the treatment. So we're going to start plugging in at each successive treatment the LDL for the individual at 4,000 hertz. So this is over a 1.5 year period, so it's going to change by about 25 dB over that range. So what you see when we do that, so basically I'm showing this as a loudness growth function, which is just in this case, just showing the connection between basically the hearing threshold and the loudness discomfort level being represented in the little inset panel. So if you walk through this, you'll see the corresponding input-output growth curve, and then you see the corresponding gain function at the bottom. Well, what you see in the end with the green function represented in the gain function at the bottom here is that we've made a previously nonlinear hearing aid user into a linear hearing aid user. So the fidelity of the that you would expect out of a hearing aid using linear processing should be appreciably better than you would expect out of a nonlinear hearing aid. So this is a big deal. You should be able to expand the dynamic range for the individual and then in turn incorporate that into your hearing aid fitting and make a nonlinear hearing aid user almost or toward a linear hearing aid user. So this is what Davis wanted to do years and years ago. So we're Rich and Monica and Dave and Bobby are all of us are involved now, we hope, in a clinical trial that will allow us to test this. And so we just submitted the trial application last week. So hopefully in a few months we'll learn whether we get to actually test this out in a group of patients. Okay, at this point, I want to turn it over to Dave and let Dave talk a little bit about a project that we're working on with help from Brian Pollard in terms of recruiting some subjects for us.
Well, thank you, Craig. You've set it up nicely, and I just want to briefly introduce you to another project that we're working on, but directly related to all the data that Craig has just shown. I think pretty convincingly he's shown that low-level sound generators can expand dynamic range, and he showed that for people with normal hearing and normal dynamic range, as well as people with reduced loudness tolerance and people with normal loudness tolerance but elevated pure tone thresholds, the typical recruiting ear. And so if we think about treating debilitating hyperacusis, Carol Samet, Dave Preeves, and Bill Bundy, way back when, proposed a treatment, which they didn't actually carry through, but they did the first part of the treatment, but they proposed that you might be able to use output limiting to make a hearing aid comfortable for a person who has reduced loudness tolerance and just have severely or very, very low output limiting. And then as their dynamic range increases, you might be able to gradually increase the output limiting. But they never actually combined that with any treatment that would expand the dynamic range. And now Craig has shown that we have such a treatment. And so our goal is to develop a new device that would be suitable for someone with mild, moderate, perhaps even severe hyperacusis, and try to get them from their current management strategy into a more helpful management strategy. And so your typical severely hyperacusic patient will come to you wearing at least earplugs, if not earplugs and earmuffs. Craig has shown some data to say that that may not be the best management for them. It might actually exacerbate the condition a bit. But if you try to put that person into a sound generator, you're saying, I need to take away your earplugs and now give you a device that's going to make sound. And that's not very palatable for most people with hyperacusis. So our idea is to create a device that starts off as a really nice earplug. And so we do that by making the portion of the device that goes in the ear have a heat-activated stent. And so when you put in this, basically a shell like in the ear hearing aid, as it gets to body temperature, it expands and makes a really nice seal. So you get a very nice, basically earplug. But the device itself also can function as a sound generator. And so you can then, over time, gradually turn up that sound from being completely off to a low-level sound generator that provides the treatment effects that Craig has described. Then you can begin to wean the person off of the earplugging effect by having amplification in the device that can actually get you to unity gain, which is a transparent device. So you basically don't have an earplug, but you don't have amplification. And if the person needs amplification because of hearing loss, you can continue the treatment and then hopefully get them to the point where you can have amplification in that same device. So it functions as an earplug, a sound generator, and a hearing aid in the same device. And so what we show here is just the earplugging component. So you've got, say, a moderate level input to the device. It gets attenuated by the good quality earplug that we're providing, and that is what is delivered to the ear. We then gradually add sound therapy with this low level white noise that gets shaped by the frequency response of the ear, and that initiates the treatment and allows us to move towards the ability to gradually amplify sound. So you see in sort of the third set of waveforms there, it starts off being attenuated by the earplug, but over time through treatment, we can release the earplugging, get towards unity gain, and then even begin to provide some amplification if they need amplification. And then you want to be able to protect this person from really loud sounds, which actually can perhaps even undo some of the treatment effect. So we use compression limiting, and we have some very high fidelity compression limiting that we can actually crank down to as low as, say, 60 or 65 dB. But then with treatment, we presume that we'll be able to gradually increase compression limiting. Another big feature of this is if you get away from earplugs but have compression limiting as your protective device, you now have normal exposure to soft and moderate sounds in the environment as opposed to attenuated exposure to soft and moderate sounds in the environment. And what you're limiting for this person is really loud sounds. And we can combine this with a nice aggressive impact sound management system, very fast acting sound impulse reduction basically, to also add a secondary protective effect. And so it has some of the same concept of a earplug once we get into the sound generator and unity gain function, because we still have the compression limiting. And that's what Samet said would be the right thing to do, but they never had the sound generator to fully implement the treatment effect here. So what we've done basically is taken Samet's idea of an analog device with compression limiting, or in their case it wasn't compression limiting, but it was peak clipping limiting, and we've added this sound generator, and now in a triple device translates somebody from earplugs to hopefully useful hearing in the everyday world. So with that, I think that was about all we were going to say. Is that right?
I think Brian and I differ a little bit on the benefit of listening to louder sound, or being exposed to louder sounds. What this shows is that if you take a group of workers who have worked in an intense industrial noise for a number of years, and then 2 years later, after they've retired from this industrial noise, you'll see shifts. What basically this is showing is shifts from A to B, of representing a decline in their loudness discomfort levels of about 30 dB. So this says that if you work in an intense environment day in and day out, and you retire from that environment and go to a less noisy setting in your retirement, that you can expect your loudness discomfort levels to drop appreciably. And this is a true case of adaptive plasticity in the real world. So it's not with any sort of treatment devices being used. It's just getting out of a noisy situation that you're in and day out, and moving into a quieter situation. And it's pretty dramatic that you can get effects like this. My guess is that at some level it's important to be exposed to healthy, higher level sounds. If you're going to improve, if you're a hyperacusis patient, if you're in the clamped situation where Dave just showed. So in the compression limiting, if you don't expose an individual to healthy higher sound levels, my guess is you're not going to be able to improve them a whole lot. And so I think that's important. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at in this study is let's say you've got them clamped down at 70 dB, so they're never exposed to sounds above 70 dB, and you're using sound generators. It may defeat the purpose of using the sound generators because you can't get them to levels that you want them to be at. So in a sense, it's like earplugging. So it's opposing the effects of the sound therapy. And since we haven't done the study, I can't prove this yet, but that's my guess. It's what might happen. And so here's what Brian was interested in yesterday. So these are 8-hour equivalent dose levels for typical noise exposures in daily life. So So the continuous black symbols over toward the left, or function over toward the left, are the results for a group of men, what they're exposed to on a daily basis. And the dashed function, just to what the left of that, would be what women are exposed to. So I don't know, 50%, if you look at the 50% below, above, whatever, it looks like it's in the range of what, 79 dB, 78, somewhere in that ballpark. And then you look at and see what different professions are exposed to on a daily basis. So if you're in the mining industry, you're probably exposed to something, I don't know, what, 85 dB or so. And U.S. Air Force, they're exposed to somewhere in that ballpark too. So depending upon what your normal work situation is, you're going to be exposed to sound levels that would be well above what Brian wants you to be exposed to. And so that may affect how you're able to recover and not recover from a hyperacusis situation. I don't disagree with anything Brian said, but this really are the types of levels that people are exposed to on a daily basis. So I think it's probably important to be exposed to healthy higher sound levels. Let's stop. Thank you.